drawing herself up. She was about to reply, when Harry turned back to his dishes. "I'll tell Hestia, and then you won't get any." Artie froze in indecision, then sighed. "It rankles that a boy is daring to give me orders," she said angrily. Harry smiled at her over his shoulder. "I'm just asking nicely, Artie. I spent a lot of effort on those, and they're a surprise." The goddess of the hunt eyed him, and Harry felt a bead of sweat pearl down his forehead. Artie could get really angry over the strangest things, and Harry worried that he had done something silly. Maybe he should have just given her the cookies, but then he wouldn't have any for Miss Zoe, who was going to be his new teacher. Hestia had recommended the cookies for her specifically, hadn't she? "Fine," Artie finally said. Her tone was rather cool, Harry thought, but he'd take it. "It's a rare man who dares tell me what to do, and doesn't feel worried about it when I voice my displeasure." Harry swallowed. "I was worried," he said. "You get really angry sometimes, and I don't want you getting angry. You're still my friend, after all." Artie was still studying him, her intense silver-gray eyes seemingly string into his very soul. Harry didn't like it much when she stared hard at him. Her gaze felt heavy. "Oh?" she finally said. Harry nodded, drying off the utensils he had just finished rinsing. "Yup, you're awesome. You teach me loads of things, and I like you, so you're my friend, even if I know I probably am not your friend." He looked up from his drawing. "Do you want me to keep that quiet in public?" Artie's gaze seemed to intensify. "If that were even possible, what is it you're asking?" she demanded, a current in her voice that sounded dangerous. Harry swallowed, and focused on his drawing so he didn't have to look at the angrily staring goddess of the hunt. I mean," the boy started stammering, then collected himself. "You may not want people to know we get along, so you may want to act like we don't know each other in public." Artie was quiet, and for the first time, Harry realized why Hestia had called her Artemis instead of Artie in that huge meeting room. Artie was his friend who taught him things. Artemis was the goddess who hated boys and wanted nothing to do with him. He'd have to keep the two separate. "No," she finally said. "No, I do not need you to keep quiet about our arrangement. There is no need for discretion. We have a perfectly normal teacher-student relationship. There is no need to hide that fact." She approached. Harry wasn't watching her, but he felt her coming closer. "It is most unusual that you would consider me a friend, especially after recent events." Harry hesitated, not sure what to say. "You're awesome, Artie," Harry said, "and you're a really good teacher, and I like you, well, mostly. I don't like it when you get angry at me, but you know what I mean." Artie studied him closer, and then nodded. "I would not get angry at you if you didn't say stupid boy things." Harry offered her a tentative smile, looking at her for the first time in a while. "Sorry, my offer to turn you into a girl still stands," Artie said, grinning. Harry relaxed. Grinning Artie was friendly Artie. He liked friendly Artie. Harry smiled back. "Only if you let me turn back into a boy if I don't like it," he replied. The goddess of the hunt shook her head. "Come on," she said, and started to walk out. Harry grinned, raced to get his box of cookies and his notebook, and finally followed her. Once again, he got to ride in her chariot with those cool golden deer. They remained silent for the trip, and Harry enjoyed the time flying through the sky, gazing at the ground below. As they circled in for a landing at a large clearing in the middle of some forest Harry didn't know, the goddess turned to him. "One piece of advice," she said, on the exact same tone that she always used when teaching him something really important. "Not all people enjoy hugging. You seem to enjoy the practice. I would advise against trying to hug one of my hunters." Harry swallowed. "All right, Artie," he said, quickly. "Hestia told me to be polite. I guess not hugging is part of that, then." Artie nodded once, sharply. "If you do, I will be forced to curse what is left of you, and I do not want to deal with the lecture Aunt Hestia would give me." Harry frowned, not understanding her statement. "What do you mean, Artie?" The goddess aimed the chariot for the landing spot she was eyeing. "If you try to hug one of my hunters, two things will happen. 1. The hunter in question will hurt you severely. If you survive, I, as goddess of maidens, will be forced to curse your remains." Aunt Hestia would be most displeased with that course of events. "Oh," the young boy said, feeling his palms sweat. "Yes, oh," Artie confirmed, injecting just a small note of teasing into her tone. "Hestia said that your hunters hate boys. Do they all really hate boys that badly?" He wondered tentatively. As the chariot touched down, Artie seemed amused by the question, rather than upset. "Some more than others, but you will be safer if you assume they all do," she answered. "I am very protective of my hunters, and most of them have been hurt very badly by males." She stepped out of the chariot, and turned to look at him. "What you said during the solstice meeting calmed Aunt Hestia and saved me from being on her bad side. This has earned you a favor, which is why I am even bringing you here. I do not have the time to teach you properly, and I am trusting you to remain the studious student that I have grown to know." "Thanks, Artie," Harry said, finally climbing out of the chariot himself. "I won't let you down. Hestia told me a bit about what Miss Zoe's like, so I'm sure I'll like her." Artie stared at him for a bit. "It amazes me to hear a boy say those words," she said, amused. Harry grinned back. "I like you, too, Artie, and from what Hestia has said, that's strange, too." The goddess of the hunt shook her head in amusement. "This way," she said, striding off and expecting him to follow. Used to the way she would sometimes issue short commands, Harry followed her into the camp. It was arranged in a circle, with identical tents surrounding a campfire. He smiled at the sight of the firefires had started setting him at ease ever since Hestia had taught him some of her skills. Harry flinched when he noticed that a dozen large, white, wolves were circling the tents. The animals eyed him as if he were food. One of the hunters was feeding a treat to one of the wolves, but stopped when she noticed him. In fact, every hunter that noticed him, stopped and stared. Some of them stared angrily, too. One hunter seemed to suddenly have a bow in her hands. Harry blinked, not having seen where she had been keeping the weapon, but when the hunter started raising it, he took 2 quick steps to be closer to Artie. He resisted the urge to grab her hand and hide. Artie wasn't Hestia, and after the talk they just had regarding hugging, he didn't think Artie would take kindly to the action, even though he desperately wanted to. He looked back. The hunter no longer had her bow out and was just grinning at him now. He sighed in relief, so he'd fallen for her trick. At least she hadn't really wanted to shoot him. "Phoebe has a lot of problems with boys and men," Artie said, apparently having seen what happened without actually looking. "If you keep away from her, there shouldn't be an issue." "Okay, Artie," Harry said, looking over his shoulder at the hunter called Phoebe, who was now seemingly talking animatedly with the hunter next to her. Whatever it was she was saying must have been important, as there was lots of hand-waving going on. Harry turned back to focus on Artie and watch where he was going. It wouldn't do to bump into her, not here. Harry was really starting to doubt this arrangement. The hunters really did seem to hate him, not like Artie, who was just cool and standoffish, but in a very real "I will hurt you" kind of way. "Here we are," Artie said, pulling the flap back on a tent that looked just like all the others, and stepped inside. Harry hurried after her. Artie stepped up to the middle of the tent, which appeared to be far larger on the inside, and sat down next to the hunter that was already present. Harry looked around, curious. The tent was warm and comfortable, with silk rugs and pillows covering the floor. In the center, a golden brazier was burning without smoke. Harry smiled at it, grateful for its presence. Behind Artie stood a polished oak display case, holding the silver bow he had seen when she had split his arrow. This time, he got a closer look at it, and noticed that it was carved into the shape of horns. He continued his look, his gaze gliding over the walls covered in animal pelts of all types and kinds. Something moved, something Harry hadn't noticed in his excited inventory of the tent. It was one of those magnificent deer. The animal languidly moved to Artie's side, and put its head in her lap. Smiling at it, she patted its neck. Harry never would have imagined those magnificent golden deer to be like house pets, but there was. Maybe that was why they didn't seem to mind when Harry petted them. "Harry, this is Zoe Nightshade, my lieutenant, and my oldest friend, Zoe, be known to Harry Potter, my student, under the patronage of Hestia, goddess of the hearth and the home." Harry offered the girl a tentative smile. Zoe had coppery-colored skin, dark brown eyes and a slightly upturned nose, and had a silver circlet braided into the top of long dark hair. She studied him in return. Artie didn't seem troubled by the dragging silence, and sat watching them with an amused smile on her lips. Harry noticed first. "You're enjoying this?" he accused. Zoe bristled. "Thou should show respect to my lady," she snapped out. Harry looked at her in confusion at the outburst. "It's all right, Zoe," Artemis said. "It was how he was introduced to me. I have come to appreciate his candor, sometimes," she finished with a tightening of her eyes. Harry felt trapped, despite having the exit to the tent behind him. The fact that he was the only one still standing, clutching that box of cookies and his notebook, made it feel like he had been dragged into the teacher's office at school. He wasn't sure the cookies would be helpful now, or even welcome, not with the way Zoe seemed to be glaring at him. "I must admit to some amusement, though," Artie said, still smiling. "After your talk about how you were sure you would like my old friend, seems that you are failing." Harry frowned at her, and Zoe seemed to cast an unsure look at the goddess. "My lady?" the hunter asked, confused. Artie turned to look at her companion, still smiling. "On the way here, we had a small discussion on appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Harry then told me that he liked me, despite the fact that I am rather indifferent towards men and boys. He also told me that he was sure that, since he likes me, he would like you, as well. It's not a nice thing to stir up trouble, Artie," Harry muttered with a pout. He was going to say more, but Zoe interrupted him. "Despite thy assurances, thou would address my lady with such disrespect, boy?" She was halfway to her feet, when she was stopped by a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Zoe. As I said, it was how Harry was introduced to me. He means no disrespect," Artie said, calming down the girl and making her sit. "I must admit it was quite childish of me. I merely wished to point out that plans do not always go as expected, and that sometimes, despite your best efforts, you sometimes can't get along with people." Harry sighed, as Zoe sent Artie another look that he couldn't decipher. "I want to get along with Miss Zoe, though," he muttered. He looked at the hunter in question. "After everything Hestia said, and everything Artie said, you sound really awesome." Zoe blinked. "I thank thee," she offered, not having expected compliment of all things. Seeing himself on steadier ground, he stepped closer, and held out the Tupperware container. "Hestia said you liked these, so I baked some. I hope you like them." Zoe glanced at her goddess, who seemed to be pouting for some reason, then stood up to accept the box. Opening the container, she picked out a cookie at random and studied it. "It appears fine," she said, as if unsure whether it was actually edible or not. Harry held his breath when she bit into it. Her eye opened and a sound escaped her that she seemed to blush at. The cookie vanished into her mouth with incredible speed, and Harry let out his breath, smiling widely. "She liked them." "Thou made these?" the hunter questioned intently. Harry nodded. "I baked them this morning. I used Hestia's recipe, then tweaked it a little." A second cookie, half eaten, remained frozen halfway to her mouth. "Thou took a recipe of the goddess of the home, and modified it?" Harry nodded. Now that they were calming down, Harry realized that Zoe had an accent that was thick and unusual, one that he thought sounded exotic and perfectly fitting for her. "It was a mortal recipe, so I took some ambrosia, grated it into the really fine powder, and used just a sniff of it to bring out the flavor of the chocolate. Just enough to enhance flavor, not enough to turn into an ambrosia cookie," he explained. Zoe still looked at the cookie, and then glanced at him. "Does Lady Hestia know thou hath modified her recipe?" Harry shook his head. I'll discuss it with her tonight when she comes over. I love discussing recipes with her. She knows a ton about cooking." The hunter nodded, then finished off the cookie. "Tea is delicious," she admitted, as if it pained her. "I thank thee." She looked at the box. "I also hope Lady Hestia will not be upset at thou modifying her recipe." Harry smiled widely. "Hestia loves it when I improvise. She says that the best way to learn is to experiment." Some tension seemed to go out of Zoe's shoulders, and Harry wondered why that was, until he remembered how Artie could get angry with him for silly little things like asking the wrong question, so he thought Zoe must have been concerned for his safety. He offered her a smile. For a moment, she looked like she was going to smile back, then seemingly remembered herself, and sat down instead. "They are delicious," she repeated herself, as she sat comfortably and ate another cookie. "He also wouldn't let me have any," Artie said, still pouting. Zoe stared at Artie, before changing her incredulity over to Harry. "Thou denied my lady?" she asked, her tone halfway between shocked, appalled, and angry. Harry shrugged. "Well, yeah, I made them for you. It would be kind of a waste to bake you cookies, and then let someone else eat them." "You didn't bake me cookies when we first met," Artie said, still pouting as it seemed Zoe wasn't about to share her bounty either. "I gave you macaroni and cheese," Harry replied, "and you loved it." Artie crossed her arms, and looked away. "Yes, I did," she said, as if admitting it hurt. "Thou canst cook as well?" Zoe asked. "Not only cookies." Harry smiled widely. He would have to do something very nice for Hestia. Her suggestion of baking cookies seems to have broken the ice with Zoe. "I live by myself, Miss Zoe," the young boy explained, "so I always cook for myself. Hestia has left me a book of recipes, and I try new ones every day. Hestia has said I learn quickly, and that I'm pretty good at it." The hunter nodded. "High praise coming from a goddess," she said. Artie grunted, and looked away, still not having gotten a cookie and seemingly unwilling to straight out ask for one. Zoe looked at her goddess, and apparently realized what was wrong. "Wouldst thou like one, my lady?" She offered the container. "Yes, please," Artie said, not even bothering with pretending otherwise. Snatching one, she bit into it as if worried someone would take it from her. Zoe seemed as amused by the goddess' actions as Harry was, not that she showed it as obviously as he did. "Anyway," Artie coughed, after devouring her cookie and realizing that she had finished it just a tad quickly. "Zoe, I have been teaching Harry the basics of survival over the last couple of months, and it has come to the point where I don't have sufficient available time if I am to teach him properly. I have brought Harry here for training. In other words, as we discussed, I would like it if you were to consent to taking over his training." The hunter was silent for a few moments, while Harry gave her hopeful looks. "My lady, is this a command?" she finally asked. "If thou were to ask it of me, then of course I shall." Artie shook her head. "I would never order any of my hunters to spend time with a male, especially not if it is against their wishes. This is strictly voluntary." Zoe turned her gaze back to Harry, who was still doing his best to give her hopeful looks. "We shall see," she finally decided, addressing him. "I still give thee a lesson. I shall expect the very best of thee. If thou passes, we shall continue, until such a time that thou fails, or thou decides to stop." Harry nodded, grinning widely. "That's how Artie's been teaching me too, Miss Zoe." "I don't mind." The hunter seemed to sigh, and debate with herself on whether this was a good idea after all. She shot another look at her goddess, who just looked back, amused. "My lady?" Zoe asked. "Art thou sure?" Artie kept her amused look. "It was how I was roped into this as well, Zoe. Hestia asked me to teach the boy how to survive in the wild. I decided on giving him one lesson, make it harsh, and ensure that he wouldn't wish to continue. Instead, I found myself with an eager pupil, who kept up despite my efforts." Zoe nodded. "Very well," she said to Harry, "we shall start. Follow me." She nodded to Artie. "My lady." Artemis' look of amusement grew at the sight of her lieutenant's disgruntlement. "Thanks, Miss Zoe," Harry said, grinning widely. "Thanks, Artie." He shot at the amused goddess of the hunt, following Zoe out of the tent. The hunter kept up a good pace, and little Harry had to leg it to keep up. "Explain to me why thou art interested in these lessons, boy," she said as they walked. Harry's legs pumped, but he managed to keep up. "Do," he started, and then asking, softly, "Do you have to call me that?" he asked, plaintively. "Call thee what?" Zoe asked, confused, shooting him a look. Harry swallowed. "Boy," he said. "It's what they—" He stopped, then forced himself to continue. "Zoe had to know. My aunt and uncle called me that when they threw me in my cupboard without food for a few days." Zoe looked at him, and for a moment, Harry thought her harsh look softened. It may have been his imagination, or not, because she kept quiet a few moments, then nodded. "I see," she said, "just like some of my sisters. Thou hast not had good guardians." She nodded once. "I shall refrain from calling thee boy." She fell silent again, thinking for a few moments. "Please remind me should I forget." She looked down at him, staring intently at his face. "Let me know if there is anything else I should avoid saying, or doing. I may not like thee, as thou art male, but that does not mean I hate thee enough to wish to remind you of certain events." Harry smiled at her, tentatively. "Thanks, Miss Zoe." She dipped her head once. "Now, please answer my original question. Why doest thou wish to learn this?" The young boy swallowed. He hated talking about this part of his life, as he didn't want people's pity. "My aunt and uncle didn't feed me a lot," he finally said, "so I got used to being hungry. They also told me that it was okay to food with funny colors or with fuzz on it, even if it tasted funny. Hestia told me they were lying, but when you get hungry enough, you'll eat it, you know." Zoe stared at him, hard. Harry swallowed, and went on when she remained silent. "They must have gotten tired of me," the boy whispered. "Because they left me in New York after buying my passport from me for $100. I used it to buy food, and a blanket, but then the money was gone, and I was tired and hungry again, so I ate out of a skip when I could." "A skip?" Zoe asked, her voice a curious lilt, as if she were bracing herself for an answer she wouldn't like. "It's a dumpster, I think Hestia called it, a large metal container outside of buildings where people throw trash, and people throw away lots of food, even if it's fuzzy and tastes funny. When you're hungry enough, you'll eat anything. That's why I want to learn plants and animals and survival and things, so I can take care of myself and I don't have to go fishing in a ship, because they get emptied every now and then you get really hungry." He swallowed, and then looked away, scuffing his foot on the ground. "I'm good now, and Hestia is really great, but maybe she'll grow tired of me, too. My aunt and uncle did, and they were family. Good things don't last, so I want to be able to take care of myself." Zoe kept staring at him. When he gave no sign of continuing, she said, "I see." She went silent again, thinking, "That is a proper reason," she finally decided. "Surprising as it is," she added. Again, silence, more thought. "As I know Lady Hestia, she would not abandon thee easily. My lady, too, seems to have taken a liking to thee. However, tea is never a bad idea to be prepared for the worst. One never knows what the future will bring." Zoe started walking again, and Harry followed. He didn't want to think about being left again, but he had to be ready just in case. His aunt and uncle had abandoned him, and they were family. They stopped at one of the tents, and Zoe pulled back the flap. "This is the Supplely tent," she explained. "Pick one of the backpacks and follow me." Harry went in, and noticed a dozen or so backpacks of the kind and size that Artie usually conjured during her lessons. He never had to carry one before, as Artie always conjured them in place, but Harry wasn't about to fail his new teacher in her first lesson. He looked the packs over, found them all to be identical, and picked up the one that was best situated for him to pick up, one that was on top of a couple of others so that he didn't have to bend down too much. He carried it out, and found that Zoe had already started walking. He tried putting the pack on his back, but it was almost as tall as he was, making it difficult for him to walk as his feet kept bumping into it. Somehow managing to catch up, he kept working the pack in an effort to make it more comfortable for him to follow her. "Thou seem to be struggling," Zoe noted without a hint of helpfulness. "It's the first time I carry one," Harry explained. "Artie usually conjures one when we arrive. I've unpacked and repacked one dozens of times. I've set up the tent dozens of times, but Artie's never had me carry one." His heels bumped into the pack when he took a larger stride. "I see," Zoe said, looking him over. "It does appear to be slightly large for thee." "Keep walking," she instructed when she fell back behind him. Harry kept walking. He felt her hitch the pack up higher and adjust the straps. "That should hold thee," she said, stepping out from behind him, and rapidly taking the lead again. "Thanks, Miss Zoe," Harry said, grinning widely. "Remember how it is done." "I shall not remind thee," Zoe said, just dipping her head in recognition of his gratitude. Harry nodded, took his notebook, and made notes to remind himself to study the pack when they stopped so he could figure out how it was done. "We shall go to that forest of there, to a clearing I know," the hunter stated, pointing straight ahead. "There we shall see what you have learned from my lady." "Okay, Miss Zoe," Harry said. They walked in silence, Harry's smaller legs pumping to keep up with the hunter's longer, easygoing strides. When they entered the forest, Harry struggled to keep up. Zoe seemed to know instinctively where to put her feet to avoid slipping on the mossy floor, or avoid holes, or anything else that would break her stride. Harry, despite having been in forests plenty of times with Artie, had never been pushed like this, and he had to work hard to keep up. When they finally arrived at the clearing, he wanted panting and sweating, while Zoe didn't even bother to look even slightly winded. "Good, thou kept up," she decided. "Please put up the tent." Harry dropped the heavy pack. "Yes, Miss Zoe," he managed between gasps of air. Thankfully, this was something he had done plenty of times before, and within minutes he had the backpack unpacked, and the tent put up. The hunter circled it, studying it intently. "Very good," she praised. "Very good indeed. I can see where my lady hath trained thee. Thou did it precisely and true to the rules." Harry smiled at her, thankful for the praise. "Thanks, Miss Zoe." The hunter dipped her head, yet did not make to reply while looking at the tent. "Break it down, I shall show thee how to do it quicker," she finally decided. Harry broke it down and repacked it, precisely following the steps Artie had shown him. His new teacher took the pack from him. "My lady is the goddess of the hunt," she said. "That means that she does everything according to the rules, in the best way possible. However, in most cases, one does not need to follow the best way, one needs only to follow the most efficient way. This is how a hunter pitches a tent," she explained, and pitched the tent. Harry stared. It was far quicker, far quicker. He could also see where Artie's way would be better on uneven ground, during storms, or with any kind of adverse conditions. Following Artie's way would get the tent pitched, but like Zoe said, this ground was flat, there was hardly any wind, there was no storm, and so, the tent could be pitched faster. He grabbed his notebook, flipping to the page detailing how to pitch a tent, and started writing. The hunter stepped over, and read over his shoulder. She nodded as the boy wrote. Suddenly, she interrupted him, and pointed out a mistake he was making. "Thanks, Miss Zoe," the boy said, smiling at her over his shoulder, and correcting himself. "I am pleased thou art taking this seriously," she commented when he was done taking his notes. "Now that thou hast written it down, thou art to do it." She pointed to the tent. "Break it down and put it up, as I showed thee." Harry nodded. "All right, Miss Zoe," he said, starting to break down the tent. As he worked, he kept his attention to the tent, but asked, "How would you put up the tent when there's a storm?" "Observe," she said, making him look up. She seemed amused. As he watched, she pulled a package out of her inner pocket, something the size of a pack of gum. She threw it to the ground, and it unfolded into a perfectly pitched tent. Harry stared at it with open mouth. He then looked at her, and back to the tent. That's amazing, a gift from my lady, Zoe said. We use it while on a hunt, during bad conditions, or when time is of the essence. In an effort to not become reliant on it, we will pitch our tents normally under normal conditions. Whoa, Harry just said. Zoe gave him an amused look before approaching her tent, and making it fold back into its pack of gum format, which she put back into her pocket. Now, I do believe I gave thee a task to perform. Harry nodded hurriedly and quickly went back to work. Sorry, Miss Zoe. She seemed even more amused now. It is always fun to see the reaction to my lady's folding tents. Harry didn't react, feeling as if she were teasing him. After he broke the tent down, he put it back up using the quicker technique she had just shown him. It took him a couple of times to get it right. Contrary to Artie's technique, this one left him with a collapsed tent on the first few tries before he got it right. Good, she said, when he finally managed. Now, do it again. Harry simply nodded. He was used to performing a task over and over again for Artie. This was no different, and so he broke it down and did it again, and again, and again, until Zoe determined that he did it right and had the technique down. Good, his new teacher decided. Repack they pack and we shall return to camp. Okay, Miss Zoe, Harry said, doing his best to repack everything as it was supposed to. He felt good about what he learned, but his nerves were hammering about her decision. Would she continue to teach him, or not? He hoped so. She appeared really cool and had taught him a neat new way of packing a tent. After packing his tent, and finally documenting the changes she made to the straps so he could carry it somewhat comfortably, he followed her back to camp. During the voyage, she kept up a constant commentary on the plants and trees along the way, which forced Harry to scribble notes while on the go. A couple of times, he nearly ran into a tree, only managing to avert a collision at the last moment. As they emerged from the tree line, Zoe halted her narration. Good. Thou needst to learn to keep watch on thy surroundings. Thou never knowest when thou may need it. Harry just nodded, huffing again from both trying to keep up with her long strides, and from trying to keep both an eye on his surroundings and writing notes at the same time. He ignored how her accent came if it made her hard to understand sometimes, and went. It was unique and he rather liked it. Even they arrived back at the hunter's camp, and Zoe had Harry stow the backpack where he had gotten it. After adjusting the straps back to their original configuration so they wouldn't bother the next hunter who used it, he exited the tent and found his new teacher and his previous teacher locked in discussion.